Welcome. I'm Grover Norquist. I run Americans for Tax Reform as its president. And this is the first installment of Leave Us Alone with Grover Norquist. We're going to be talking about all the various parts of the modern center-right movement for liberty in the United States. And right now, today, we're going to be talking about taxes and a little bit about spending. I'm here with Isabel Morales, who's a policy communications specialist with Americans for Tax Reform. She's worked on Capitol Hill, a graduate of American University with economics and a public policy degree. Isabel, we're talking about the suggestions for tax. It hasn't happened yet, but the threats, promises, suggestions, outline of the tax policies of the Biden administration that will only take place if all the Democrats in the House and Senate agree and put it into place through budget reconciliation. They will not require a single Republican vote, and chances are they won't get a single Republican vote for their tax hikes. On the corporate income tax increase, could you talk about what that does to competitiveness? Because the argument the Republicans made when they cut the corporate income tax was that we needed to do that to be more competitive internationally.
Right. I think that's probably one of the most prominent problems with this tax hike. Right now, Senate Democrats are proposing a 25% corporate income tax. So that would leave us with a combined federal and state rate of about 29.5%. China's corporate tax rate is 25%. The OECD national and subnational average is 23.51%. So overall, that puts us at a disadvantage against China and really the rest of the world. And as we know, capital is mobile, so capital can move overseas pretty easily. And when you have jurisdictions that are more tax favorable, that's what happens. So from there, we'll see investments move overseas from the United States. We will see jobs move overseas. And overall, especially coming out of a pandemic, it's going to be bad for the U.S. economy.
Well, when Biden was vice president and Obama was president, the corporate rate was 35% here in the United States at the national level, the federal tax. But as you point out, there's a 5 or 6% average state corporate income tax. Most states, I think one or two, Wyoming doesn't have a corporate income tax. Most states have a corporate income tax that average between 5 and 6%. So you have to add that on to the 35%. We were really closer to 40 when we competed with China, which was at 25. As you say, the Europeans at 23.5. With no surprise that people were moving overseas. Companies were inverting. Burger King was bought by a Canadian company because their corporate rate was lower than ours. In addition to the question of competitiveness, what happens with who pays the corporate income tax? Obviously, corporations don't pay the corporate income tax. They kind of don't exist. Corporations can't go out and have a hamburger or take a vacation or buy a new car. People pay taxes. Maybe the corporation collects it. But what do economists say? Who does it come out of? Out of investors who own stock, out of workers who maybe get paid less, out of consumers who have to pay higher costs of buying something because the company that's making shoes has to pay taxes, and that money needs to come ultimately from consumers at some point.
Right. Yeah. Most of the corporate income tax is borne by workers. Most studies show that around 50 to 70% of the corporate income rate is paid through lower wages or less jobs. Even some studies show in the long term, up to 92% or even 100% of the corporate tax rate is borne by workers. And the Tax Policy Center, which is a left of center organization, their best case scenario is that workers only bear 20% of the corporate income tax. And Biden wants to impose $2.5 trillion worth of corporate tax hikes. So you're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars worth of lost wages.
If they're doing $2.5 trillion in tax increases, corporate, and 1/5, 20%, is $500 billion in lower wages as a result of their tax increase. And that, as you say, is a very left of center group that makes all the assumptions in one direction. Most groups say upwards of 50%, which would be $1.25 trillion
Exactly.
over the next several years in lower wages. The number I do remember from the last several years was in 2019, second year, not 2018, 2019, the second year of the Republican tax cut. You saw the median income for households increase 6.8%, which was $4,400.
Right.
And now, if Bill Gates made $1 billion more, the average would move up a little bit. But if Bill Gates makes $1 billion more, it doesn't move the median because he's already in the upper half. You have to have the whole middle move together in order to get $4,000, the median $4,000 up, $4,400 up. That has happened because of the lower corporate income tax. When you raise it, it begins to move the other direction. That's a rather expensive move.
Yeah, especially for coming out of pandemic. Like, we already have unemployment levels recovering. And the fact that Joe Biden thinks that now is the right time to be raising taxes, especially one that's primarily borne by the people who have suffered the most from this pandemic, is pretty egregious.
Who else ends up paying the corporate income tax? What are the other ways that that the economy has to pay those taxes?
Yeah, so I mean, you could see it passed on through pricing. You can see less investment going into the business itself or being invested back into the business. A lot of it from workers gets diluted in a lot of ways.
One of the things that I appreciated was a series of studies that John Karch did when the corporate income tax was originally cut in the 2017 legislation. And he noticed that Pepco in DC put out an announcement: we are now going to cut everybody's utility bills that Pepco sends out for electricity. Why? Because under state and local law, the federal government puts a tax on the utility, on the company itself. They pass 100% of that on to consumers. It just goes right through into the bills of people who are utility customers. And when the federal income tax is cut, or any other income, excise tax, whatever tax is cut, they have to, by law, reduce what they charge. So they're not allowed to keep charging you for a federal tax that's only half as big as it used to be. But the converse of that is that when you raise the corporate income tax, the utility is allowed to raise its billing to all of its customers because federal government made their lives more expensive. They get to pass it on and do. So just as we saw a wave where about 90% of Americans saw lower utility bills by billions of dollars across the country, we're now going to see those utility bills go up.
Yeah, and then it begs the question, is Biden then keeping his pledge to not raise taxes on people who make less than $400,000, because it may not be taxing them directly, but the people who are feeling it are people who are making less than $400,000.
What about the capital gains tax? That's another one of the tax increases. There's the corporate income tax they want to raise by a couple $1 trillion. There's the capital gains tax for individuals and for companies. And then there's the stepped up basis. Could you talk about the capital gains tax?
Yeah, with capital gains, he's looking to double it. And ultimately, with capital gains particularly, it has this lock-in effect on investors. So because once they sell an asset, it will be taxed at that point, they're more inclined to not sell the asset at all. So instead of trading up assets or like investing in new startup companies, investors will just keep the assets they already own. So then you have a slowing of economic activity, and almost every study has shown that capital gains tax hikes don't actually increase revenues. In fact, a lot of times they've decreased tax revenues that the government collects. So it's very much so a confiscatory tax. And when Obama was asked about how it doesn't necessarily raise revenues, he was like, well, this is actually about fairness, not necessarily about
That was very interesting when he was asked, you do understand that raising the capital gains tax can actually often bring in less money. And he said that was okay. He didn't care. This was not an effort to raise money. This was an effort to punish people who are successful and reduce inequality, not by helping poor people or unemployed people get a job and be better off and therefore be closer to Bill Gates. He wants to see middle income people collapse their incomes so they're closer to the guy on the street, to the homeless people. Instead of getting the homeless guy a job, you can reduce inequality by reducing the pay for a doctor. And the other thing with the capital gains tax is we had a capital gains tax almost as high as Biden wants. And that was in the 1970s. And it was so bad for the economy that a Democratic-led House and a Democratic-controlled Senate got together and forced Carter to reduce the capital gains tax. And now Biden, who was alive and well and one presumes paying attention in the late 70s, he wants to go and take the capital gains tax back up higher than Carter had it. So he wants the business taxes, the corporate income taxes higher than China, higher than the European Union countries. He wants the capital gains taxes higher than Carter, who described his own economy as one infected with malaise. This was not his critics saying this is a malaise. This was Carter explaining what you got, guys, is a malaise. I did this. And so they began to undo what he did. Now, explain the step up in basis, which is, we used to have a step up in basis. Biden wants to get rid of it. What does that mean?
So off the top of my head, we have like to call a step up in basis really a second death tax. Basically, it would impose a capital gains tax on unrealized gains.
So when mom dies and I get the family farm or the dry cleaner or a small business or shares of stock that she saved up all during her life, separate from the original death tax, which is still there and which Biden says he wants to increase, but also says he's not going to do it right now, which makes you wonder. He thinks people are not going to swallow all this very well. I'll talk to you later about the other punishment you get. But where he says he wants to get rid of the step up in basis, which in the past, right now in law, when mom dies and gives you the family farm, you take, what's the basis when you sell the family farm 20 years from now? That is that you take what it was worth when you inherited it. That's the new basis. And then you pay capital gains on the future earnings. You don't pay capital gains on the earnings during your mom and dad's lifetime. That is yours, and you pay taxes on what happens when you're up and around until you sell it. And therefore, you don't have to, when you get the family farm or a small business, come up with hundreds of thousands of dollars in capital gains payments in order to own the family farm or family business or stocks that were owned earlier. This law was actually, what Biden wants to do was done in 1976. Again, Biden was around House and Senate in 1976. And they voted to get rid of the stepped up basis in 1976 in tax reform. And there you had our friends, the Democrats ran the House and the Democrats ran the Senate, and Jimmy Carter ran the presidency. And they said, I'm sorry, Ford was president, but the other team had the votes to override him. But the Democrat House and Senate did it. Ford signed the bill or vetoed it and got overridden. Then they never implemented it because it was too difficult to implement. The New York Times referred to it as ridiculously difficult, and that nobody liked it. And in 1980, before Reagan took office, but while Jimmy Carter was president, Democratic House, Democratic Senate, they voted to repeal this. So something that the Democrats tried for 4 to 5 years to make work, decided they couldn't make it work, decided it wasn't worth the effort, decided it was too complicated, too intrusive, and voted to abolish, is something that Biden's now holding up as if it was new and different and would work. He's now putting that on the list of things that he wants to get done. So he's take both the higher capital gains taxes, which were rejected by the Democrats in the 70s, and the elimination of the stepped-up basis, the second death tax, is now, which was also rejected by the Democrats in the 1970s, who were a fairly liberal bunch at the time. Now Biden wants to put both of those in as his shiny new ideas. They're actually old, tried, and found wanting tax ideas.
Right, yeah, and with Stepup Basis, repealing it would disproportionately fall on family-owned businesses because a lot of them are asset rich but cash poor. So the tax they'd have to pay it through liquidating their land or equipment or other assets that they own.
Yeah, I remember reading that there were more millionaires in Idaho than you'd think,
yes.
Because there are people whose land was very valuable, but they may not have a lot of cash to buy, go to an expensive restaurant, but their farm was very valuable. So asset rich, but cash poor. And then, of course, try and pass that on to a child, and all of a sudden you find you're really cash poor because you have to go into debt to get a farm or land that your parents owned. What else should people be focusing on? Because Biden is going to try and focus on all the cool stuff he thinks he's going to pay for, and probably not want to talk too much or not too explicitly about who he's going to take it from. And he did during the campaign say the only people who got a tax cut under the Republican tax cut were the very rich and corporations, which was a slight problem because, of course, the median income family of four earning $73,000 a year got a $2,000 tax cut. The middle income, the median income single parent, one child, median income about $40,000 got a $1,300 tax cut. So there were significant tax cuts for middle income, lower income Americans. Biden kept lying about that during the campaign and saying he was going to repeal all of the tax cut that Trump put in. Turns out he's promising now not to repeal some of it, but we never know because he said both things during the campaign, that he wouldn't tax anyone who earned less than $400,000 a year and that he would tax everybody who earned less than $400,000 a year in the same speech. We will find out what Congress and he are doing. What other thoughts? What else should people focus on as the president gives his speech and gives us a sales pitch for why all these old ideas are really good new ideas?
Well, probably what all these ideas are meant to pay for. He's framing these next few spending plans as, quote, infrastructure bills, but infrastructure is a very small part of both of these parts.
What percentage of the $2 trillion in one of the two bills that he's pushing forward now does he call infrastructure, and how does he define it? It seems to me that over the last 20 years, infrastructure appears to be a French word, which means everything except roads and bridges, because they keep expanding the definition. What do Americans think infrastructure is, and what does Biden's team think infrastructure is?
So I think most Americans view infrastructure as roads, bridges, maybe waterways, locks, dams, ports, airports, and maybe even broadband now. And if you combine all of those and how much Biden is spending on all of those, that's about 13% of the first part of his infrastructure plan. When the Washington Post was encountered with that percentage argument, they rebutted it and said, well, actually, no, traditional infrastructure makes up 25% of his plan, the first part of his plan. And even in that best case scenario, that's still a really low amount for an infrastructure plan that is being dubbed as infrastructure. And really the single biggest item in the first part of his plan is spending on long-term care, Medicaid spending. So that's $400 billion. That's 20% of his entire plan.
Well, he's also now talking about $80 billion given to the IRS to go do more audits of people.
Right.
The IRS is a unionized facility around the country. And when you put $80 billion in hiring people, and then they pay 2% of their wages and union dues, which is what teacher in Wisconsin does, You're talking about $1.6 billion in union dues over the next several years. And the union that represents the union that takes money from the guys who work at IRS and spends it any way they want, gives 97% of its money to the Democratic Party. So they're really pre-funding the next set of elections by putting this money out, saying it can only go to unionized workers in some of the care issues and so on. And therefore, they're going to get 2% back when they spend trillions. They're going to get 2% back in union dues, which goes to 97% Democratic candidates. You can see the Democrats have already, with the $6 trillion they want to throw up in the air, begun the process of funding themselves permanently with taxpayer money, paying for union dues of people working on government projects, who then turn that money around and contribute to and volunteer for Democrat candidates. The IRS itself has 500,000 hours of what's called official time, which is where somebody who's paid by you and me as taxpayers to work at the IRS actually is full or part-time, is actually doing union work, which could be just campaigning for the local Democrat. And they admit to $500,000, 500,000 hours a year, 500,000 hours a year. If you're paying them $10 an hour, that's $5 million contribution. If you're paying them $20 an hour, that's a $10 million contribution. And these are trained, serious people who probably are the equivalent worth more than that. It is a tremendous taking from the taxpayer, money laundered through DC, and then people volunteer, paid people volunteer into Democratic campaigns. So a lot of the people ask, why are they doing some of these things? It's a very expensive way of laundering a big amount of money through union coffers and back into the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and they're also, with the IRS funding, most of it's really going towards enforcement and auditing. They want to be able to audit more people. And there's also apparently an item in this proposal which requires banks to report money in and out of somebody's account if the IRS is looking into that specific taxpayer's.
If you're a small businessman or self-employed person, you will have zero privacy with your bank account. Your bank account will be open to the IRS to look at anytime they want, like they were searching for drug peddlers or something, or money launderers. Privacy will be gone. And of course, when they start doing it for self-employed people, small businesses, why would you not do it for everybody sooner rather than later?
Yeah, any tool that they develop to be used against so-called rich people is going to be used eventually against.
I remember thinking when they started taking away banking privacy from people because terrorism or because illegal drugs, I thought, it's not going to end there. This is not a good idea. They should go catch people some other way rather than something that's so obviously going to soon and quickly end up being used against average citizens and taxpayers. Right. So, Isabel, we're going to wrap up now the first installment of Leave Us Alone with Grover Norquist, and we're going to be looking at different parts of the Leave Us Alone coalition, people who tend to vote for liberty because they care about homeschooling or the Second Amendment or religious liberty or being self-employed or an independent contractor or vaping, anything the government steps on and kicks and doesn't and wants to punch you for doing. People have organized and said, you know what, I want to vote for more liberty. And taxes, of course, as we find throughout history, whether it's the French Revolution or the American Revolution, taxes tend to be, or the British Revolution, taxes tend to be a big part of what motivates people into political action. And that's why I run Americans for Tax Reform. But there are many, many parts of the Leave Us Alone coalition. We'll be looking at all of them. So, Isabel, thank you for joining us today. And to everybody, have a good evening. Take care.